Hello, good evening everyone. I'm happy to be with you today. My name is Michal Furmankiewicz, and during this Azure Back to School period, I'm going to present you a session about the landing zone in the scale in a regulated environment. A couple of words about me. Most of you probably haven't heard about me. I'm from Poland, I'm Polish. My name is easy for you, but the last name can be a bit complicated. You can find me on Twitter or LinkedIn using the same name, M-I-F-U-R-M. A couple of words, what I'm doing, what I'm interested in. So I'm the architect and a consultant with over 17 years of experience right now. Last 7 years, I'm working mostly with Azure, but also touching some other clouds as well. And I'm mostly interested in areas like architecture, monitoring, security, but also I do a lot of projects around foundation and landing zone with enterprise customers. I was named by Microsoft with Azure MVP, and I'm also a certified Microsoft certified trainer. Anyway, this is all about me. I don't want to spend too much time, so let's get straight to what I think it's interesting when it comes to when we talk about landing zone at scale in a regulated environment. So I'll do a lot of some kind of intro to give you a sneak peek of what I feel is happening when you're talking with enterprise customers and in a regulated environment. We'll talk about the environment, about how it's worked in the regulated environment, what landing zone is, and then I would like to open a kind of a discussion where we will be talking about the areas to discuss with the customer around the landing zone as well. Then hopefully we'll talk about code management, and in the summary I'll try to give you a couple of tips and tricks for you so you can better feel when you will do your environment, your landing zone project. Anyway, couple of things before we'll start. What I feel regulated environment is every single environment in which you have a kind of authority. In Poland, for financial sector, we have KNF, which is part of EBA. EBA is a European Bank Association, which associate all the banks. And EBA and KNF, both those entities, have their recommendations around how you should use cloud computing solutions in banking sector, especially if you do some stuff around customer data, about their standings, especially if you work in a production environment. Those areas are somehow regulated. The recommendation is not that, I would say, strict or precise. There are other recommendations, so you have to know how to implement them. Anyway, there are some other law which regulate certain things about the about how you build the IT environment for such a customers. Not only financial customers are regulated. When you look at the pharmaceutical companies, when you look at the military sector, when you will talk with energy sector, all those sectors, all those companies are somehow regulated, and those regulations are similar. How impact it gives you, or how much it will impact your project? Well, in many ways, those customers are really strict about the security. They are really strict about the separation of environments. They are really strict in the way they monitor their environment. So it really impacts how do you think and how do you work with the foundation for them. And of course, if you will combine regulation with enterprise environment, which is usually a brownfield, those things get a bit complicated because the customer is big, has a lot of technologies, has a lot of apps, they are talking with each other, so it's like spaghetti code. I mean, those apps are talking with each other, so they make a kind of a spaghetti. The security department's requirements are usually way beyond what Microsoft can offer for them in the first approach, and there are lots of standards all around, and those standards are using a number of technologies, number of ways with which you have to integrate your solution as well. And the last but not least, which is a really, really important fact, is that people in IT are mostly not prepared for that change? Well, of course, some of them are not yet. It's not easy to transform your IT environment so they can embrace cloud computing. In many ways, they have lots of things to do. They don't have much of the time to learn new things. Cloud computing is not that easy these days. This is quite a complicated thing. So all those things are, creating an environment in which the adoption is not an easy one. What's even more challenging is that in financial institutions environment or enterprise environment, building a strategy of how you want to migrate your workloads to the cloud involves lots of stakeholders, not only technical ones, also business ones, with whom you would like to talk about this new architecture. I mean new architecture because in most of the cases you cannot pick apps as it is shown on this upper diagram. It's not like you will just pick a couple of those and you can migrate. No, you have to be really careful which of them you choose, at what stage you will be able to move them, and how you will be able to move them as they are interconnected. As you can see on this blurred picture, which is part of the architecture of one of the customers with whom I've been working, is that you can see different colors showing different phases of migration depending on the business, depending on the technology, depending on how the app is ready really to embrace the cloud computing. And this is a detailed approach. This is a detailed view. Underneath you have the whole strategy, which usually lasts not 2, not 3, but 5 years. And it's usually too short to really embrace what you want to build. And why I'm saying that how this part can impact the landing zone? Well, it can, because for me, landing zone should also standardize the way you deploy your workloads. So this thing have to be prepared as well. Anyway, I think you get the idea what I think about the enterprise environment, what I mean by big customer, what I mean about the regulated customer. So let's get into some details so I can be more specific on some stuff. So what is landing zone or foundation part? Well, many of you may say, Michal, why you are talking about that? This is some basics. Those are some basics, and you're right. Those are the basics. So without them, you cannot start your real migration. You cannot start building your apps. But preparing that is not that easy, because it's a basic cloud environment architecture in which you will place your apps, in which you replace your solutions, and which will guarantee some basic services, right? Around monitoring, around security, around identity, around networking, all of those things which are required to place your apps and workloads in that environment. And the scope of this project can be infinite. Even though the areas which we have to cover are pretty well defined, there are lots of things which may enlarge every single topic for that. My approach or my idea is that landing zone should also standardize the model in which you deploy the infrastructure for various workloads. So you have to be careful, because it's if you want to build that in the regulated environment, you have to know what type of workloads we will be building there, because many of them have different requirements towards networking, towards identity. Some of them have different requirements regarding encryption. So all those things you should have in mind when you're building this type of environment. And of course, the technology is one thing, but the process around that, how do you involve other parties? How do you involve teams inside the customer to help you with that? This is something very, very tricky, can be very tricky, but without that, the technology is just useless. So if you will not include that part in this landing zone phase, you will finish with a great infrastructure deployed in the cloud without any notion of people who will manage that or who will be able to develop that, right? I've been in the project where we were mostly focused on that part, and then when we released the whole foundation, we are the only people in the company who are able to follow up and to develop this solution. What Microsoft is saying about that story, well, it's very, as I said, technical approach. So you can see areas which should be covered during that process, and they are pretty well defined. I mean, there is nothing we can be, we can criticize about that. However, I think that this approach, which I will show you in a GitHub in a moment, is missing certain parts. So you don't, there is nothing there about adoption and the organization and how the team should be built around that. There is not much about the processes. Of course, they are described at the very high level, but every org is different, so you have to adjust those processes. Excuse me, and those documents don't talk much about how to work and manage the code of this whole environment, which can be tricky as well. So let me show you how Microsoft is doing that. So I'm opening I'm opening GitHub right now, and probably you know that link. So if you will go to Azure Enterprise Scale, you will find a beautifully laid down documentation with lots of referential architectures in here, which are showing different approaches for smaller customers, for software houses, and for enterprise customers, which are more centralized in the way they manage the IT infrastructure. And they are, really insightful of how you can deploy certain services, how you can deploy networking and things around that. But they are not talking much about the third parties, which is quite understandable. They're not talking much about the code. They are not talking much about lots of security things, which I will show you in a minute when we will go deeper. So what is the key in this project? What can get painful? How this project can be painful? As I said, adoption is the key. Without it, it will not work. We know that. However, on the other side, when you are building a solution for a big customer, it usually takes from 6 to 12 months sometimes. I've been in that projects, and cloud services are not really easily to change, right? You can ask Microsoft to do some stuff, but it will not happen soon. So you have to overcome some limits. You have to overcome some lack of flexibility, and you have to have some idea for that. Why? Otherwise, you have some expectations, you have some cloud services, and you cannot change much for some of those, which then, will imply how you implement certain things. Think about things like, okay, how we can manage the subnets, how big subnets should be, how many subnets we should have for a certain project, how well we can, define the number of subnets for a project. So those are the things which have to be decided probably upfront, because then you cannot change much about that once you will deploy your solutions. On the other hand, cloud services are under constant process of changing under a constant process of updates. So when do you plan a solution? Then in 6 months you may hear from the vendor, okay, we've changed that, and you know what? We are not sure how much we'll be supporting the previous version. It happily doesn't change that much, but you have to have the answer for that, because changing the basic infrastructure, networking infrastructure, may not be easy in next 6 to 12 months. What is also not easy in the enterprise is that lots of cloud offerings are not enough for certain environments, for enterprise environments. So if we are talking about infrastructure as a code approach, CI/CD pipelines, dynamic role-based access control management, or security, some of those solutions built into the cloud are not enough for many customers in many areas. I will talk about that as well. And because of that, because of the of the previous point, I mean this around enterprise requirements. Well, it may happen that building the landing zone requires a lot of code, a lot of a lot of things you have to do by yourself, or you have to deliver using some third parties. So that's why it may take a time to deliver that. And let me show you a couple of areas which I want to discuss with you during this talk. Probably I would like to spend a day with you all to deep dive, but we don't have that much time, so I'll just cover certain things. So let's start with the identity. Identity is not an easy thing, especially if you want to, think of Azure, maybe another cloud provider, and then you will add that the solution you have, and you want to, integrate those with functionalities like conditional access, privileged identity management, or the identity governance. But also, what cannot be easy as well is that for some customers, what they want to do is that they want to use the same identity while they are logging to the cloud, but then accessing different solutions in the cloud, they want to use facades, identity facades to change that identity into some different identity. There are solutions offered by different vendors who are allowed to do that. Not an easy one for many services like Power BI and others, but yeah, it can bring some security, or at least this is what enterprise customers tell me when they think about identity. Another part, which is also quite interesting, is everything about managed identities like SPNs, managed identity, and registering the applications. You have to think about who can create those SPNs, who will delete them, who will manage the how you will manage the permissions for those SPNs. How will you control that those SPNs are not used by someone from outside of your organization? Well, those are not easy questions for SPNs, as they are not easy to manage at all. Of course, managed identity solves some of those issues, but only for those services who are sitting inside the Azure. So for integration services which are sitting on-prem or in the other cloud, managing the SPNs is not an easy way to do. Let's talk about networking. Well, this is a topic in itself. I mean, we can spend a number of hours talking about that. So instead of talking, let me show you a couple of diagrams which I have prepared for our conversation. So in here you should see some management groups and some subscriptions and some proposed architecture of those. But let's leave this. Let's focus on the networking part. So this part should be pretty easy, right? Well, you have some transit network to put all your transit, so your VPNs, your express routes, maybe some other solutions to build the connectivity between on-prem and the cloud, maybe some other cloud. You have some workloads, VNets, where you will put all your workloads. And then you have some shared services network where you will put services which you will share shared among different projects. Maybe you will build a DMZ zone in here. So this looks easy, right? But then when you think about the details, it's not so easy. Because, okay, what would be the approach? How we should divide the big VNet into subnets to deliver those subnets to the projects, right? Should we have 4 subnets for one project? Maybe we should have 6 subnets, maybe 8. How we want to build those subnets to limit the traffic between the layers or between the apps in itself. Okay, we can use NSG, right? Because they are easy to deploy, they cost nothing, and they help you to manage the traffic between the layers of the app and between the apps. However, you don't have a central point to control that. So you may think, okay, let's put the subnet for some firewall and then reroute the whole traffic through this firewall. We can do that, but then you have to have at least probably 2 instances of that firewall per every of this environment which you have in here to control the whole traffic. It will increase the cost. It will increase the expectations for the throughput for those VMs. And it will make the whole environment a bit more complicated. Okay, so on the other side, as I said, you may use NSGs, right? But per every single project, then you have to keep the structure and then make sure that every project can be put in that environment. So, okay, after some conversation, you may decide, how you want to segment your networks. But let's talk about DNS. Well, this is tricky. And I must say that this part can be very, very tricky. It depends only if you want to have a DNS which will solve only the names inside the Azure, in Azure and on-prem and Azure, and maybe in some other way. And if you will add private endpoints for that, the situation gets a bit complicated. Why? Well, in the regulated environment, you would like to have a private DNS zone for the dev environment for private endpoints, which is different from private DNS zone in the production network. And this is easy when we are talking only inside each of those networks. So if in the dev network, I'm looking for some private endpoint in that network, well, this DNS will help me. If I'm doing that in the production network, this DNS, this private DNS zone will help me. But what about situation when you want to, find out the service using the DNS name and you are asking this from on-prem? Okay, your local DNS can forward the traffic to, for example, Bind server or any other server which will be in the cloud, which will forward your query to the Azure DNS, and by recursive DNS, you can try to find out your service. Why I said you can try? Well, because those private DNS zones has exactly the same names. You cannot distinguish them between different environments. Why? Because this is how Microsoft has designed that. So there is a solution for that. You can have one private DNS zone for all the environments, for dev, for prod, for pre-prod, right? And you can register all private endpoints in this one private DNS zone per each service, right? Yeah, you can do that. But then you have no control. You have all the entries in one private DNS zone, no matter which environment we are talking about. That's the one thing. The second thing is that probably to create private endpoints in a proper way, you have to give some permissions to this private DNS zone to make queries, to make entry, to put some new entries, right? So then you can, you can have a situation when someone from the dev environment will create as entry in the private DNS zone, which is exactly the same as in the prod environment. So exactly what you can really do is to make this solution unusable, right? So okay, we may say okay, so let's have two different DNS zones, but then we have to have some way, and we can use another forwarder to forward the traffic to a specific network, and then the specific network will find out your service. So this is a real problem. I mean, how you want to handle the DNS queries. The other problem is that from Azure, you cannot forward any zones to on-prem. There is no Azure DNS forwarder functionality. So you have to use DNS server inside the cloud, for example, Bind server or anything like this, which will forward all the queries to the on-prem. So those things are getting a bit complicated. Another thing which may be interesting for you is when you want to, be sure that the communication from on-prem solution to dedicated network will happen through the dedicated network interface. So you have a router in here, and you want to be sure that the traffic which is going from on-prem to dev is not mixed with the traffic which is going to production. So you say, yeah, this is fine. So let's create, let's configure this guy specifically, that it will use a different network interface but different environment. But when you think that this router can only have up to 8 network interfaces, then it may result that you can only have 6 environments. Why 6? Well, because you want to have one network interface per each environment, which give us 5 or 6 environments, depends how much you want to have. Then one network interface for management and one for incoming traffic from on-prem. And this is how the situation gets a bit complicated, because 8 network interfaces is the maximum number you can have for a VM in the Azure right now, right? So if you want to really go with all the regulations all those customers are telling you, then the Azure, then those small limitations which I've named are becoming more and more, impacting on how you can design your environment. The same things happen when you connect the express route. Okay, we've connected the express route. Life is beautiful because we have a dedicated connection, a physical connection, and this is fine. But when we think, okay, let's build another region for us. So for example, this is West Europe. We would like to have a possibility to move the whole environment to the North Europe, right? Well, sounds easy, but then you will have to think about another express route to the another region. Then you will probably have to think about copying exactly the same infrastructure there. Then you have to think how you will be, routing the traffic, because what this may result in is asymmetric routing. So this infrastructure becomes complicated and more complicated every single time you want to introduce those type of changes. Okay, I think I give you a sneak peek of what can happen with the networking. There are more things around that. I will not cover them all, but let's leave them for now and let's move on. So I was talking about identity, networking, DNS, DMZ. I've mentioned that, but let's go further. Roles, my favorite topic, I would say, because of course Microsoft prepared a lot of inbuilt roles and they are great. I'm really impressed how well they were designed. But of course, customers would like to scrutinize the possibilities, the roles you have in the environment. So we say, okay, let's build the custom roles, right? What can go wrong, right? Well, of course we can build those custom roles, and I've built a lot of them, right? You can see a custom role for the Postgre, which is limiting some specific actions on the PostgreSQL database, because I would like to make this role as strict as possible. So you see all the roles, and some of them are commented. So this is a sample role. What can go wrong with that? Well, Microsoft is changing, what actions you may do for each service provider. So it may happen that this particular action is not available tomorrow, and when you will try to deploy that role, it may happen that you will not, you won't have that role. So Azure will tell you, please get lost. You have to change that. We have changed that. So okay, you may say, I don't want to use that much of custom roles, but then it seems that this is the perfect way to, as I said, to scrutinize those roles, but then you have to have someone who will keep them updated, who will keep them in sync with what Azure offers, and who will manage them for changes which may happen. Another thing is that when you think about role management, this role management thing is not easy if you would like to do it dynamically, because people are coming to the org, they are leaving the org. And Azure, okay, gives you this ability to assign permissions, but when you will think you would like to, make this dynamic. So the person comes, he has he's in a specific department, he has a specific manager. There is no easy way to map the business roles into technical roles, and this is not a wrong. But for enterprise environments, you'll have to think about the solution which will solve that problem as well. Another thing which I love a lot is policies. Of course, you have a lot of inbuilt. I want to rather go with custom in many areas, as the custom policies, and as you can see, lots of custom roles in here. Why custom roles? Because if you have an inbuilt role and something will change, Microsoft will change that role for you, which is great, which is perfectly fine in many environments. But in some cases, you don't know what have happened to that role because it was changed automatically. So in many cases, you want to keep an eye on those roles and build your own roles, your own policies to make sure you really control what's there and that they work in a specific way. And I want to say that Azure policies can be kind of tricky, because there are certain policies which are looking great, but they are not great when you will implement them. Let me name a few. So you'll say, okay, I don't want to have a storage account which has a public, which is publicly available, and I want only have storage accounts with private endpoint. Sounds great. But what will happen when you will create Azure SQL with that type of policy, which will say deny any public available storage accounts? The Azure SQL service will not be created. Why? Because Azure will block that. Because during the process of creating Azure SQL, there is a storage account created under the hood which you don't see. And this storage account is created with a public endpoint, and then it's changed into private one. So if you will say, let's deny any storage account with a public endpoint, the Azure SQL service will not be created. There are a number of those things in Azure, and you have to be careful, because sometimes you don't know that setting up the policy for storage will impact such services like Azure Backup, for example, right? Like possibly Azure Function. If you will create a policy that every resource group should be created with a specific pattern, then, for example, your Arrow cluster will not be created. So there are lots of those small pieces which you have to be aware of, because they may really impact your environment. And if you will implement those policies, one advice from me: test that all your services which you want to have in Azure are still deployable from the code you have, or from the code you have. Otherwise, you may encounter the situation when the new policy blocked the service which was perfectly deployable yesterday, right? Other areas, monitoring. So I think the monitoring and security are very, very related, because of course you can use, Log Analytics, Azure Monitor, and you can connect them to Azure Security Center, use a Sentinel, and this sounds great. But in many situations, customers would like to use their own solutions. And if they pick their own solutions, there is no simple way to connect those solutions to Azure Security Center. So either you have to export the data from those solutions to Log Analytics and then import them to Security Center Sentinel, or from perspective of these services, you don't have a data which are required to, to control those services. Some of customers are saying also, okay, Michal, we want to use our on-prem solutions, monitoring solutions for that. Well, this brings another complexity, because if you think about how many data you would like to have to export from cloud to on-prem, and then you calculate how much of your networking will be, how much you will impact the throughput of your networking between cloud and on-prem, and how much it will cost, then it may turn out that there is no good reason to export those data to on-prem, right? If you think about those custom solutions, you have to be aware that probably from the security perspective, you will not be able to use what's inbuilt, or this functionality will be limited, especially if you are using the Azure Defender, right? Because Azure Defender works great, but only if it has data. If it doesn't have the data from the apps, from the infrastructure, well, yeah, you may not expect anything from him. But security is way bigger than only the services you want to use. It's also bigger because many customers has lots of expectations around the security which are beyond what Azure can offer today. Excuse me. So in case of hardening the services, in case of doing the image analysis of VMs, in case of analyzing the code, there are lots of those areas which you have to define with your customer, and probably discuss about the third-party services which can be used as well for that part. If you have a lot of database solutions, you probably are looking for something which will, maybe do some simple DLP for your databases. Then you may look at the Imperva or any other vendor you like, right? Anyway, security is a great area where you can, really see, what challenges customers have, and what other vendors can be brought to the table to solve their issues. But I want to point two things: hardening of the services and deployment of the services. So lots of customers with whom I'm working are asking, okay, let's prepare the hardening for that service, And this hardening is related to identity, networking, things around what specific settings for particular service, and any other things which may impact the security of a particular service. And this is great. But in many cases, if you will harden the solution you want to build for a customer, there is no way to deploy it through the portal. So you have to have everything in code. Otherwise, probably you will not be able to deploy that. Some hardenings require some additional things in the landing zone infrastructure. So let's imagine we want to deploy the Azure OpenShift cluster in a hardened way. It's great that right now you can reroute the whole traffic from the subnets in which OpenShift cluster is working, and you can reroute this traffic through firewall, and then on the firewall level limit the number of FQDNs which OpenShift needs to be installed. But as I said, if you want to have this service in a hardened way, probably there are some other things to do to fulfill that. Let's leave the monitoring and secrets and keys for now. But what I want to say is that there are lots of areas of security in Azure which are probably not detected by Log Analytics, Security Center, or Sentinel in itself. So there is a great place for those who are interested in security to write your custom code for those services to detect the issues which may occur, which may be specific for your customer. Anyway. There are lots of areas, as I said, but one thing which is also important and which is not easy to answer, and it's usually assigned to specific organization, is how do you manage the code? How do you manage the code which is deploying the landing zone? How do you manage the code which is deploying the infrastructure which you have for your particular workload or for your app? Well, there are a number of ideas how you can do that. This is kind of a sample code which I have in here on my right. And this is the Terraform code. I'm most using Terraform right now. But actually the question is not really related to Terraform. The question is related how you want to work with the code, how you want to divide the code. Where do you put the code for networking? Where will you put the code for network, for subnet, for a specific solution? Where will you put the code for roles, for role assignments, for users? Plenty of questions. What can you do? Well, why I'm saying this is also important, because there are lots of teams inside such a big org, and each of this team would like to still be useful in this new cloud era, right? They don't want to lose their impact. So usually we have a team which is taking care of identity. The other team is taking care of networking. Some other team maybe is looking after the databases. Some other team about the infrastructure. So you have different teams, different responsibilities, and each of these team would like to keep their jewels close to them. So you may divide your code for infrastructure, for landing zone, and for infrastructure for specific project, between the teams and their responsibilities. And it's possible. And in many ways, this is the way I do. So I divide the code through the teams or the areas which they are taking care of, and then I divide the code per different environments I'm building for specific customer, as you have seen on my Draw.io drawings. But you can also think that for some project code, you may divide this code in a different way. So you have a landing zone in different states managed by different teams, and that's fine. But the code for specific project has a dedicated state kept in some other repo. Well, this is also possible, but then working with state, it's not that easy. But yes, you may think that this will work that way, or you may still think that the code for the projects will stay with a specific team, and the project, to create a code for the project, will be divided into different teams, which will together create the basic infrastructure for your project to lay down your solution. As I said, you may combine those two approaches. But what else is interesting? It's also interesting, how you will divide those competencies between different parts. How you will distinguish the infrastructure code with the app code. If the infrastructure code is in one repo, and the app code is in a different repo, there are some challenges, especially for serverless applications, which this kind of distinction will not really work. And the last but not least question is, okay, but how do you will manage the CI/CD pipeline for the whole landing zone? Probably you will have many pipelines with many SPNs involved, and then you will be able to do that. Okay, so I just give you a sneak peek of what challenges I discover when I'm working with big customers, when I'm working with customers who are very strict around security, and what may happen when they have some regulations which really impact them, how they can work with those solutions. So, okay, you may say, what can go wrong, Michal? If you already did it a number of times, what can happen, in the long term? Well, basically, what can happen is that lots of those things which I have mentioned are related to the infrastructure. So then, when you will say, okay, we've done some stage of the project, let's release that foundation to my project teams. Let them deploy whatever solutions they would like to our environment. In many cases, if they don't get how this whole foundation works, if they don't get what are the principles, what are the ways to deploy your infrastructure, they may say it's too complicated. They may say we are not able to deploy our solutions. We don't know the Terraform, so we don't want to write the code. They may also say it's a bit too vague. If I have to create a team using different teams in my org to create simple things for my environment. So I think there is a lot of things to do around the processes and around, telling the people how to use this, how to deploy the solutions, how I can get my own environment, what I need to do. And the really key question is, how do you streamline that? Because on the one hand, you have to be secure, you have to be you have to comply with your regulations. You want to have a process, but on the other thing, all the things you do have to be usable. They have to be usable in the way that you can deploy your projects. So this thing may really blow up if you don't think about that, building your foundation environment for a big customers. Guys, thank you for being with me in this online mode. I hope I give you a couple of sneak peeks what can happen if you're building a landing zone for a big customer in the regulated environment. I hope some of those relates to you and it rings the bell. If not, write straight to me. I hope to help you to understand it better or to share my experience in some specific topics around that. Thank you for watching me and hope to see you one day face to face. All the best. Cheers. Bye.